Okay, everyone, welcome to this webcast arranged by Common Europe. I'm the marketing director for the umbrella organization for local user groups throughout Europe. One of the really big or more important topics for this platform is modern tools and technologies, and open source is definitely one of them. One of the best in the world on this topic is Aaron Bartell. So we invited him for doing this, and we're very glad he wanted to do this. Aaron, I will hand over to you, and I can take care of any questions in the chat window, and we can take them afterwards. So I will mute myself until the end of this session. Welcome, Aaron, and go ahead.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm very excited about the topic I'm going to be talking about. Just a brief introduction of myself. So I work for Kringle-Tech, and what we're doing at Kringle-Tech is introducing a services model for helping people adopt open source technology. So if you're in an IBMI shop, specifically for IBMI. So if you're in an IBMI shop that's traditionally done RPG and DB2 and green screen apps, that's also our legacy and our history. And what we found is we can produce results very quickly with open source technologies because there's such a huge ecosystem of tool sets available. So that's what we're providing a lot. So I just wanted to make note, if you head over to litmus.com, you'll find a lot of free resources. We're writing about 2 articles a month in an effort to verse the IBMI community on all of the open source that's available and some of the different things you can do with open source. So go ahead and check that out. All right, so I'm going to go back a slide here, and you can have these slides after the presentation for future reference. What we're going to be talking about today is Node.js, how that can communicate with DB2 and RPG. They're talking together, and this is a great thing. And we'll be digressing into what is exactly Node.js and what can I do with it, and then again, how can I make that communicate with my existing resources, the tools and business logic that I've invested millions of dollars in over the years, tens of thousands of dollars, what have you. How can I make sure to not let those go the way of the buffalo, and instead continue to make use of those in my shop? So some things that we're going to be talking about. Why should I even care about Node.js? What's special about it? Don't I already have an open source language in PHP? Why shouldn't I pursue that, and why should I pursue Node.js instead, or should I not pursue Node.js? There's lots of approaches to open source technology, lots of decision making, so we'll be talking about that a little bit. Also, Node.js is written in JavaScript. We'll be talking about a few topics. I said it's for noobs, meaning a new person to the language, but these are really special considerations if it's your first exposure to JavaScript. There's some interesting aspects to the language that me coming from an RPG background, I wasn't immediately aware to me how the language works, so I had to verse myself in that when I first picked up JavaScript a number of years ago. We're also going to be introducing you to the DB2 access for I. So this is the way that Node.js can make a direct connection to DB2 for I right on your machine. So there's no middleware that is in place. You don't have to go to MySQL first and then make a connection, or you don't have to do ODBC or JDBC. This is a solid direct connection to your DB2 for I. And then also introduce the toolkit for I, which is a way that you can communicate directly to any existing IBMI resource. Now that could be an RPG program, either a regular program or a service program. It could be a data area. You can actually even get a listing of the work active jobs if you wanted to. So an extremely flexible tool. All right, so what is Node.js? Make me care. Node.js is server-side JavaScript, and it uses what's called Google's V8 engine, or JavaScript runtime. So this is something that Google has used over the years in their Chrome browser to make JavaScript work on the client side, on the laptop. Now, by way of a gentleman by the name of Ryan Dahl. He introduced V8 and Node.js on the server side, or I should say Node.js. People have been doing server-side JavaScript for a number of years, but Ryan Dahl made it popular. So that's the kicker. JavaScript now can run on the server side, and as of fall of last year, it can now run on IBM i. So this is cool for a number of reasons, one of which, we're not lagging behind the times in new technology. We got this technology fairly quickly in relation to how often we usually get it. So thank you, IBM, for that. But even the bigger, cooler reality is, and this is a big seller for Node.js, imagine a world where you need to know one language for both the client side and the server side. So you don't have to keep track of two separate syntaxes, and instead you can focus on one. Now there's definitely different programming mindsets when you're talking UI programming versus back-end JavaScript programming, but again, it's the same syntactical language. That's a big time saver. Noted here also, it's ported and supported by IBM, so this is nice. You can use your existing support contract to call up with questions, but an interesting change that I'm seeing in IBM over the past probably 4 years is they've become, and this is the IBM I group specifically, very social minded, meaning they're using social media better than a lot of other parts of IBM. Other parts of IBM have actually congratulated the IBM I sector of IBMers for doing such an excellent job, including on Facebook, Twitter, so on and so forth. So I bring that up because we're finding that some of IBM's engineers are actually frequenting those social media outlets and are answering questions and are providing support in that fashion. So that's pretty cool. Some of these topics related to Node.js we won't be diving into extensively, but note that there's this concept called non-blocking I/O that Node.js has, and that's one of its primary selling points, though I wanted to make note that it's not unique to Node.js. They just made it popular. Final note, Node.js and underlying technologies all operate under an MIT-based license. So that is a license agreement between you and the software, or you and the person that wrote the software, stating how you can use that software. So this is an important aspect of understanding open source moving forward. As you adopt open source, it's important to note what type of open source license it's operating under. So MIT and BSD and things like Apache 2.0 licenses are very friendly towards businesses and commercial usage of that open source. Things like GPL v3 aren't as, in my opinion, these are opinions, aren't as friendly towards businesses. We won't digress any more into that, other than to say, as you adopt open source, go ahead and read a tutorial on the different types of open source licenses to make sure you're adhering to the rules provided under the open source provisions. So a little JavaScript. Let's talk JavaScript and relate it to the RPG mindset, because that's where I come from, and I'm guessing that's where a lot of the attendees come from. So within Node.js JavaScript, we've got this function called the require feature. And it's very similar to RPG/copy. Essentially, it's bringing in outside functionality. So when you put a /copy in your RPG code, it's meant to bring in an outside source member. Very similar in nature is what the Node.js require keyword is doing. Actually, it's not a JavaScript keyword, it's a feature of Node.js. This is also a debated topic that you can find out more at the bottom of all my slides. I've got different links that would be of interest to you guys, so go ahead and check those out and read up on the various topics. So if I want to bring in outside functionality in a Node.js application, let's say I've written a bit of business logic that I want to bring in. This would be equivalent to doing a prototype for an RPG service program. I use the require statement, and then instead of having the qsys.lib file system, I'm instead operating off of the ifs root file system. And in this way, I have a path that's similar to what we have on our laptops. So I do a folder structure path to the bit of JavaScript that I want to bring in in modular fashion as a form of a module. So if you look down here at the bottom of the page where ibmi.js is described, this is the entirety of that particular bit of JavaScript. So this would be, like me, again, bringing in service program functionality. So notice that it's got a .js extension. When you do a require, you don't need to include the extension on the end. So I'm bringing it in, and I'm applying it to a JavaScript variable. So this might be bending your mind a little bit, because didn't we just discuss that this was like a service program? Well, in JavaScript, a variable can hold many types of things. It can hold a simple data type, like a number or a string, or it can hold a complex data type, like an entire object that has functions that can be called. So it's almost like being able to store a service program in a variable. So I'm calling this variable IBMI to be similarly named to the name of the file. And then once I've brought it in, I can invoke functions that are exported out of that particular JavaScript object. So in this case, you can see I've got this function declared. A function is similar to a sub-procedure in RPG. So this is me declaring the equivalent of a sub-procedure called current user in JavaScript. And then this looks similar to our RPG sub-procedures. I've got a return capability, and I'm going to return actually the call to a different JavaScript function. And then for me to make this available outside of this ibmi.js file, I just declare exports dot, I give a name to my export, and then I assign whatever function should be given that name as an export. So we've also got this capability in RPG where when we export or if we want a sub-procedure in a service program to be made publicly available, what do we need to do? We need to export it. We use the export keyword on the procedure definition. All right, so now because it's exported, I have access to it and can invoke it from my mainline program. So this allows me, again, to obtain the current user, and now I've got the current user. So this might be profile 1, and that's a string value that's now maintained in the user variable. All right, so that's a little bit about how modularization works in Node.js. A more complicated subject is in JavaScript there's this concept called callbacks, and they're very similar to RPG procedure pointers, but what I found is not a lot of RPG programmers have had exposure or the need to use procedure pointers in RPG. So even though that's a way to relate the two languages together, it's not readily apparent. So let's dive into this a little bit. So here I've got the equivalent of an RPG sub-procedure, so a JavaScript function, and it's called myCallback. And it receives in some data, and all it does is it pumps it out to the console. So this would be like doing a DSPLY keyword in your RPG program. We're just spitting out a string variable to the console. We're next defining another function named hi, and it receives in as its parameter a function, a defined function, a callback. What that means is when hi is invoked and it receives in this parameter, this is actually, we're passing a function or the equivalent of an RPG subprocedure that will be subsequently invoked at a later point in time. Well, in this case, that's all we're doing within this subprocedure. We're immediately calling the JavaScript function, aka subprocedure, that was passed into us, and we're hard coding a value of getIt as a string, which in turn, when we invoke this, it actually invokes this guy up here. Because if we look at the last line down here, we're invoking the hi function, and what are we passing in? We're passing in the name of another function. So my callback was defined up here, We're passing that in to the hi function, and we don't actually know the name of the function at this point. We're just calling it a callback. So this is our parameter list, our inbound parameter list, and then we generically invoke that. So this is called a JavaScript callback, and they're like procedure pointers. Now, it is very important to have at least a fundamental or introductory understanding of how these work, because they are absolutely everywhere in JavaScript and Node.js programming. Now, when I first started JavaScript and even Node.js programming, I was able to exist for a while in that status of being a Node.js programmer by doing a lot of copy-paste programming from Google. That's the easiest and the best way to learn a language, copy and paste from others that are posting stuff online. But eventually, you need to further your knowledge of how these work, because basically what happens in Node.js is it's got an asynchronous programming model by default, whereas other languages don't have that nearly as much. It's much more a top-down execution type programming model. We won't be discussing that a lot. I'm just making a note here so that you are aware that that programming model exists. All right, so this is a first example of a callback. Now let me go to a next example. So within JavaScript, you can have named functions. So just like in a RPG program, you can have a named subprocedure. But then within JavaScript, you can also have what's called an anonymous function, meaning a function declaration that doesn't have a name. So that's what we have here. So notice here we have the function keyword. So this is a JavaScript keyword. But notice what's lacking. We don't have the name of the function like we did on the previous. Instead, this is an anonymous function that has the same content as the previous slide, so a console.log statement, but we're applying it to a variable named myCallback. So this is a similar way to accomplish the same thing that we had on the previous slide. So I'm just going to briefly go back to that so we can see it. So here we have function, function name. Here we have function without a name, though we're saving the result of this by way of the equal sign into the variable called myCallback. So very similar in nature. And then if we look at lines 5 through 9, it's the exact same code as what was on the previous slide. So we invoke the hi function, pass in the variable myCallback, and then it appropriately invokes it. So that's another way to accomplish the same thing as the previous slide. Let's go to the next slide. So there's yet one more way to accomplish the same things. So on this slide, the function named hi did not change, but notice we did not define anything called myCallback. Instead, we're going to put it inline in the call to hi. So what that means is I can actually pass a function definition inline as an inbound parameter to the call to the hi function. So notice again, this is an anonymous function, but it's not only anonymous, it's inline. It's part of the call. I'm defining the function as part of the parameter list to hi. So here's function, and then the console.log. So again, this is something that you can exist for, in Node.js as a developer for a while without having a huge in-depth understanding of it, but you'll quickly find that you'll benefit from having a more in-depth understanding. And if it's confusing to you now, don't worry about that. It's one of those things that it just kind of grows on you because it exists in JavaScript so much that eventually it's like, oh, okay, well, this is a callback scenario. I need to do this, this, and that, and then you're all done. Much like how you had to learn to do subprocedures when you're traditionally used to doing subroutines. So all of a sudden things changed and you could pass parameters and you could have local variables, so on and so forth. It's just a new way of doing, getting to the same endpoint. All right, so that's a little bit of a JavaScript introduction of some of the things that tripped me up when I was first learning JavaScript and Node.js coming from an RPG background. Let's dive into the meat of this presentation, namely, how do I, as an RPG programmer, make sure the investment I've made in the code, the investment my company, my business has made in RPG, which is usually multiple decades, how can we retain that and not lose that investment? And that's hugely important because, again, it's an investment. It's millions of dollars often through employee salaries and investments in trade shows and hardware and licenses that have been spent on this. So it makes sense, even if you're looking to adopt Node.js, to make sure to regain that investment. And IBM's done a wonderful job at giving us that capability by, first off, giving us a native DB2 for I adapter. And of equal importance, though, is this toolkit for I. So again, this allows me to make use of my existing RPG programs without changing the RPG program. So if your RPG program has a parameter list, I can invoke that from Node.js without you changing your RPG program at all. Your RPG program doesn't even know that it's being invoked by a Node.js program. It might think it's being invoked by another RPG program. So that's the cool thing about Toolkit for I. All right, so briefly, they're both API sets for communicating and working with DB2 for I in this case, and then interfacing with a tool called XMLSERVICE, which I'll be digressing into a little bit later. Here you can find the documentation for each one of them. And then both of these tools, they're written in Node.js and C, and they exist in the IFS at these locations. So when you install Node.js, which is license program 5733 OPS, these IFS folders or directories will be created for you, and then you'll have this tooling available. A note about configuring your IBMI environment. Now, this is also a paradigm shift. Traditionally, when you're working with RPG and CL programs and things like that, you're always on the 5250 interface at the 5250 command line. Well, there's this whole other side of an IBMI machine that's called the PASE side, P-A-S-E, Portable Application Solution Environment. Basically what it is it's an AIX runtime that instead of using the AIX kernel, it points at the IBMI kernel to do all of its lower level processing. This is really cool because this is what affords us the ability to run things like Java, PHP, Node.js, Ruby, Python, etc., and Git, things like Git, all on our IBMI, because AIX is a form of Unix and Linux is a child of the Unix world. So all those things that were developed for Linux also work quite well on our IBMI, namely in this case Node.js. So all that to say, we could use our interface to the AIX or PASE command line by using the 5250 approach. So you can gain access to this PASE command line by invoking a call QP2 term. So we're getting a new terminal, but the terminal is, in my opinion, horrid. It's just painful to use, especially if you've ever come from a background of using a terminal on a Mac machine or a Linux machine, or even, for that matter, DOS on Windows. Instead, what you should do is get an SSH client. And what that allows you to do is you, from your laptop, for example, you can SSH into your machine and then have a different type of console that has many more features. So, for example, tab completion, or using the up arrow to bring up the last previous command. A whole bunch of different features that make the shell experience much better. Now, when you're in this other environment, this PASE environment, there are some similar concepts being implemented. So for when we're in a 5250 type of job, we've got this concept of a library list that our RPG programs use to resolve various database tables and other programming objects. Well, in the PACE environment, in the AIX and Linux world, they also have this concept of paths to look at to resolve references to other programs, namely the path and lib path environment variables. So this is like me doing an add library list entry. Basically, I'm saying when you want to resolve to the node binary, so if I type in node on the command line in a shell, it's going to look through all of these folders that exist in the path environment variable to find a program named node. So again, it's just like setting my library list. And so I'm saying export, or similar to add library list entry, path equals, and then I'm prepending this path, and then I have a colon, and I say, oh, by the way, retain the existing path that already existed. So the $ path is me referencing the existing path variable. So this just allows me to have the node program available to me wherever I'm at in the IFS structure, whether I'm at in the www directory or if I'm in my home directory. Now it's available to me everywhere. In later versions of Node.js, some of these types of things are set for you. In the earlier versions, they were not. So now, again, I can be anywhere in the IFS within my shell and have access to the node program. What you'll find out as you embrace programming in the open source world, or particularly in PACE, is that there's a lot of different things that you'll do to set up your environment exactly how you want it. So in this case, what I recommend is you stick both of these two commands into what's called a shell script. You'll note that by this .sh extension. And a shell script is just a text file that can be invoked from within your shell environment. And what I'm doing here is I copy these two lines into this shell script, and then I invoke it by doing a dot, meaning don't run this in a new separate job. Instead, apply all of the contents of the shell into my current job, and then it goes ahead and runs this program. So think of a shell script as being similar in nature to a CL program, and it's a way that I use to configure my environment, or rather easily configure it. So I can just log into my machine, run a shell script, and now all my quote-unquote PACE library lists are set, and I can also alternate between versions of Node if I have the need, so on and so forth. All right, so before I get too much further, I wanted to note this environment, or this group called the YIP. So it stands for Young I Professionals, and it's a group within Common USA. It's run by Common USA, and it's a little bit of a misnomer. Young I Professionals very much so means young at heart, or young in pursuing new ways of doing business and technology. So in particular, when you have your coffee break tomorrow, go ahead and head over to youngiprofessionals.com, and what you'll find is basically a wiki, and it's a site that IBM uses extensively to introduce new open source tooling and concepts to the IBMI community. I visit it frequently, and there's so much new content constantly that I have trouble keeping up. I try to keep my mind around the whole thing, but there's just so much new content being added. So that's a place where IBM has chosen to put a lot of very solid content for us to embrace as we're pursuing these open source technology stacks, because there's just different ways of doing things. There's different ways to debug a program. There's different ways in approaching, like what I discussed on the previous slide, things like library lists. It's also a place where they're releasing open source tools that are built within their environment. So one of these next slides will be talking about the XML service open source project, and that is maintained and operates on the youngiprofessional.com website. So what is XMLService? It's a library. It's open source. It is written in RPG, and it basically is an interface that can be invoked either through a DB2 stored procedure or an HTTP call that allows external languages, and by external I mean that they're just not RPG. They could be running on the same machine, or they could be running off the machine, so it could also be a .NET program. But it allows these external languages to communicate with pretty much any resource on your IBMI. So I could call an RPG program, I could make a database call, I could call a system API, I could call a CL program, I could interface with the data area, I could interface with the data queue, both for sending and receiving. I could create a stateful job that allowed me to invoke a service program that existed in a stateful job multiple times, maybe calling different sub-procedures on that RPG service program. Just a ton of functionality, very well written, and is the means for you to retain your investment in RPG as you adopt Node.js. So hugely useful and beneficial. The main author is Tony Cairns out of IBM Rochester, and he's really put together some good work here. Again, this is hosted and stored on youngiprofessionals.com. Also, he's got a number of Node.js initiatives out on the YIPS website, so check those out. Here's a little bit how it works. So over here we've got our open source languages, and basically each one of these open source languages has a toolkit assigned to it. So there's an interface so that you don't have to manually compose the XML that goes between the layers. So instead of, and we'll see this in a little bit, instead of me manually concatenating together a string to formulate an XML document, this toolkit, the iToolkit that we discussed earlier, does that for me. And instead, I'm just making API calls to invoke an RPG program from Node.js or Ruby or PHP or Java. Now, like I mentioned before, the way that this communication happens is it can be one of two ways. The first and more performant way is to use a DB2 connection. So as we mentioned earlier, Node.js comes with a native database driver, and that database driver can be used as the conduit for making XML service calls from Node.js to any existing resource under your IBMI. That's great for one-tier scenarios, meaning where you have your Node.js on the same machine, on the same IBMI as your RPG code, if RPG is what you're invoking. The other approach is to use what's called an HTTP RESTful call. And what that means basically is all of the information is sent across HTTP on the URL and in the post content of that HTTP request. So this is a scenario if you need something more loosely coupled. So for example, maybe you've got your Node.js running on a Linux server. Maybe you've got it running on Bluemix or an Amazon EC2 instance. You could then make a secure HTTPS request from that server to your IBMI. And your IBMI would have Apache listening for inbound HTTP requests. That Apache configuration, upon receiving that request in, would hand it off to the same XML service code that the DB2 connection also uses. So they just have different interfaces, but at the end of the day, it's invoking the same XML service code, which subsequently invokes the appropriate RPG program, whatever you had specified in the XML layer. So the XML portion of XML service is actually quite small. It's just the way to do data interchange. The real power is the fact that it can take this XML, it parses the XML, and then it dynamically composes a call to all of these different types of system resources. And it then dynamically processes the response and sends it back down to the toolkit. So that's a high-level overview of how XML service works. So an example in action. So in the IFS, we have itoolkit.js. So it's located at this path. It's open source, so you can actually crack that baby open and take a look at it, see how they put it together. Now they're continually adding updates to this, so when new PTFs come out, it's a good idea to upgrade so that you can get those latest updates, because there have been, it's newer technology, so they've had some fixes that they've needed to put in place. Here's the require statement, so we remember that's similar to an RPG/copy. We're requiring the itoolkit.js file. So now we've got that stored in a JavaScript variable. And one of the functions of the itoolkit is iConnection. So this is declaring that we're going to use the local database connection. So we're using the DB2 approach instead of the HTTP approach. So now we've got a connection object. So again, underneath the covers, it's using that DB2 for I Node.js database adapter. And then we can add commands that we want to run. So this is part of the iToolkit, is it allows you to specify I commands or IPGM for programs or I data queue, so on and so forth. Underneath the covers is where they do the XML composition so that you don't have to. So in this case, we're telling it, well, run this CL command, retrieve job attribute, and give the user back. So we're adding that to the calls that will be made when we invoke XML service. So then we do the connection.run line. You'll notice that we're doing what? We're passing an inline anonymous function. So this is basically saying, okay, invoke the retrieve job attribute CL command, and when you get the response back, call this inline anonymous function. So pass the result. Here's my inbound parameter. Pass the result to me in a variable called str. So this will contain at this point the user profile of this job, and then write it out to the console, whatever that string was. I made a mistake earlier, so this is actually the response. This isn't the request. So the raw response underneath the covers looks like this. So we get some statistics as far as whether or not it was successful, and then also the row and data area is where our result set is. What was the result of invoking that particular CL command or that RPG program, so on and so forth. So in this case, we have QUser back. That's what this job was running under, the profile of QUser. What's interesting to note, and then this gets to the asynchronous programming model that I mentioned earlier, when I run this, if it took 10 seconds for it to respond, it actually goes to the next line of my program before it gets the response back. So this is what I was talking about in relation to top-down programming, that Node.js is different from RPG. If I wanted to wait until I received the response before I did my next bit of processing, I'd have to coordinate that in the code. And there's a number of ways to accomplish that, but it's very important to know, because sometimes you get the expected results by chance. And by that I mean this line of code could run so fast that you didn't notice it went on to the next line of code before this one was even done, just because it ran so fast. It got the result back, it applied it maybe to a global variable, and then the next line of code down, which I don't have right now, use that global variable for subsequent processing. So that's an important aspect of Node.js to understand. So that's an example of invoking a CL program from the iToolkit using Node.js. Now there's an aspect to Node.js that I find hugely beneficial, and it's called the Node REPL. REPL stands for Read, Eval, Print, and Loop. Now in the RPG camp we have the start debug command, or if you're an RDI user or RDP, you can debug a program interactively. So you can step through code when you invoke it and find out what values different variables have and when something hits the fan, when something breaks. Well, in similar fashion, you've got things like this REPL, which you invoke by just typing in Node without any parameters, and then that enters you into an interactive programming environment. And what does that mean? Well, from here, I can actually paste a chunk of Node.js code and have it be immediately invoked. So for example, here I am pasting the entire contents of that previous program, and then I immediately see the output. And then here's me exiting the Node REPL. Or I can choose to stay inside of here and make a subsequent call. So I could either paste in another bit of JavaScript, or I could just type it out manually and explore the result set further. So after I got the result set back, maybe I wanted to explore what was in string a little further. If it was an object, I could check different settings of the object to see what the properties were set to, so on and so forth. So it's a hugely beneficial tool for not only learning JavaScript and Node.js and how things like the iToolkit work, but it's also highly beneficial for debugging applications. So if you're trying to figure out, well, why doesn't this work? It worked yesterday. Well, you can hop into here and interact with your code in live fashion. XML to JSON. So JavaScript deals with something called JSON. JSON is basically JavaScript object notation. So when you convert, let's just put this into the RPG mindset. When you convert a data structure into a string, you can't tell when one field stops and another one starts necessarily, because it's not named data. The way that you knew where one piece of data stopped and started is because it's positionally related. Well, JavaScript operates differently. When it converts a data structure or an object to a string, it names the data. So for example, this is what JavaScript object notation looks like in this after column. So instead of just having positionally related pieces of data, when it serializes an object up to a string, it actually has name value pairs. So success, colon, true, comma, what's the next one? Well, the command was retrieve job attribute user, comma. Next bit of data. Oh, now we're defining an array. We know that by the square bracket. Within the array, there's a single object. We know that by the curly bracket. So beginning of object, end of object. Within that object, we have additional name value pairs. The name of this field is user. The value is QUser. So this is what JSON looks like. By default, and I'm guessing they'll maybe fix this in the future, or not fix it, it's not broken, maybe change it in the future, but by default, hopefully they'll maybe change it to be JSON as the passback value, because that's what JavaScript operates natively with. But for now, when we get the XML service response, we can easily convert it to a JSON object, and then from there, because JavaScript operates very efficiently and natively with JSON, we can very easily traverse the result set. So this is basically saying obtain the first iteration of the result, which is only one. Arrays in JavaScript start at 0. So here we've got a base array. And then grab me the first element of the data portion. So remember, here's our data. So this is the response portion that contains the values we're after. And then grab the value name-value pair. So it's grabbing this. If I wanted to grab the name, I'd do .name, and then I'd obtain back the value of user. But in this case, I want the .value portion of this JavaScript object. So again, before, this is what XML service passed back, and after. Debugging. So when you're going through your various coding exercises, it'll often be the case that you need to dig further in and find out why something's not working quite like how you had expected it. There's some additional features that you can specify on the connection to iToolkit. One namely is connection.debug true. What this will do, and it provides a certain amount of insight, not a ton of insight, but it'll go ahead and output this into your console or wherever standard output is redirected to. And even after that, if you can't figure out why it's not working, again, this is open source. You can look at the code. If you're new to JavaScript, it might take a while to understand the code, but it's actually fairly well written and it's very simple in nature, so I highly recommend taking a peek at it. But that's one way to start doing debugging. All right, so let's look at a way that you can invoke an RPG program. So this is 100% freeform RPG. This is something that it's very intriguing that we now have 100% freeform RPG. I'm still getting my brain wrapped around it. It is a little bit more verbose, but it allows other non-fixed format programming personalities to more easily adopt or learn RPG. So here I've basically got a program named PGM1 that receives in two parameters. So this is my prototype, this is my procedure interface, and then here's my C specs. So I'm basically taking I'm applying values. These are I/O, not just inbound, they're also outbound. So I'm applying some new values to the parameter list and returning to the caller. So let's look at what Node.js does to interface with this program. So I've grayed out the areas where my code didn't change from the previous example. So here, instead of I command, I'm doing IPGM on my XML toolkit, or my iToolkit. I'm specifying the program name, so it's PGM1, and then I've got another JavaScript object where I can specify additional options and parameters. So in this case, I wanted to fully qualify the call to a specific particular library. So it's located in my lib. And then over here, I'm specifying one, the value I want passed in, which in this case is just initialized values, and two, what the data type is. So XMLService uses this to dynamically compose the call to the RPG program underneath the covers. So it uses this to create the necessary parameter list. All right, so then I add that call to my connection, and then I run it. So this is the same as the previous example. I run it, I wait for the response, it invokes my inline anonymous function with the response, I convert that response to a JSON object, but then here's where it's different. So here what I'm doing is I'm looking for each one of those parameters. So this is me iterating over that data array. For each entry, and then I get the single result, so there's only one result, and within that, for each data entry, I iterate over and I obtain the data type and the data value. And then from here, I could save it off into some other variables. So if this is a Node.js application, usually what I'd be doing is calling an RPG program to obtain some values and then display those values to a user in the web browser. Now, that code wasn't very sightly. There's a lot going on, and I don't want to have to type all that type of thing out every time I invoke an RPG program. So here's where you should be doing encapsulation within Node.js, which is basically a way to say, make it modular, make it more simple to call. So here I've got a program, a JavaScript program called rpg.js, where I've got a lot of the same code that I had in the previous slide, but I added some additional ones. So I created a function called program1, which I'm also exporting down here below. And then I'm also doing the same thing before as far as priming the parameter list. And then what I'm returning, though, is I'm going after, because I know I know exactly what the result set looks like, I can hard code the results to say, well, I know there's only one element in the results array, and I know that there should be two separate data elements. So then I'll go ahead and grab those values. And so now I can simply invoke my program like this, rpg.pgm1, passing in the parameter list. Now I've got my result set back, and here I'm actually dynamically creating a new JavaScript object. Think of it being similar to an RPG data structure. I'm dynamically creating it, and I'm dynamically giving it subfield names. So char1 and dec1 are the names within this JavaScript object that subsequently then I can gain access to by doing result.char1 and result.dec1. So that's just a way that you can do encapsulation to make your calls to RPG simpler and better. There's a variety of data types, all the ones that you can expect. Now we won't spend too much time on this, but again, all the ones that you'd expect to be there for making calls to RPG or other IBMI system resources. All right, so what does the HTTP connection approach look like? It's very similar in nature. Basically, the only thing you're changing is the options and the connection. So I'm declaring the IP address of my IBMI, the port that it's listening on, the path of where XML service exists, and then I specify that on the invocation. So Node.js can reside anywhere on a Linux machine, directly on the IBMI, on a Windows machine, and then it can invoke XML service so you can gain access to your RPG or other programs. So after this, though, all of the other code remained the same. We just changed the approach to how we're connecting. And again, the HTTP approach is not as performant. It's not as quick. You'll see more lag times, but it provides a looser coupling than the DB2 connection approach. As I mentioned earlier, and this is a busy slide, but basically what it's saying is you can have stateful jobs underneath the covers. So if you need to invoke an RPG program multiple times and you need that program to stay active in the job, you can do that with XML service. I won't spend any more time on this. It's not I wouldn't say this is as common of a need, but it's definitely useful to have because I've used it. All right, so the iToolkit is the more complicated of the two things that I'm talking about today. The DB2 Access for I is the next thing, and I say more complicated because it's more of a new topic. For anybody that's done any form of PC language approach programming knows the common tooling or interfaces that you have with a database adapter. Well, that's what DB2 Access for I is as it relates to Node.js on IBMI. So you'll see a lot of the things to expect. You'll see a connection. What database do you want to connect to? What SQL statement do you want to invoke? So that's what we're going to be looking at here. So again, we've got the require statement. We're bringing in the DB2 driver from the IFS. This was installed with license program 5733 OPS. I don't believe I mentioned this yet, but Node.js is free. You get it at no additional charge on your IBMI. So go ahead and get it installed. And you initialize the connection. You can specify additional parameters in here if you need to. And then at the end of the day, here's what we're doing. We're invoking an SQL statement. So this is a table that exists on your machine by default, something IBM ships with the operating system. It's just a customer table. So when I invoke this, the second parameter, I pass in an anonymous function. This will receive in the result set from that SQL invocation, and then I can do with it as I like. So in this case, I'm just outputting it to the console. Normally, I'd output it to the web browser for the user to see. But here's what it looks like underneath the cover. So this is actually returned to me in JSON form already. I didn't have to convert it from XML because we're not communicating with XMLSERVICE in this case. We're going directly to DB2. And at the end, I can close my connection. Here's some additional things that you can specify in initializing your database connection. So you can set it to server mode, which basically means it will route SQL statements to separate jobs. Also, alter auto commit values. There's many different settings that you can supply within the connection initialization. We won't be going through them all, but just know again that it's a lot of your typical mindset of features you could expect in a database adapter that exist in the DB2 connection object. Similarly, when you invoke an SQL statement, you have access to all the metadata. So for example, if I wanted to gain access to all of the column names that were passed back, I could do that. And so this is a whole bunch of code that basically is just accessing the metadata of the SQL result set. So what's the name of the field? What's its length, the type, the precision, the scale? Is it null capable, so on and so forth. So just know that that's all available to you also. One of the things that's currently missing, in my opinion, from the Node.js implementation is a refined ORM. ORM stands for Object Relational Management, and it's the way to make database access easier. So instead of doing SQL select statements or insert statements, instead you've got an API-based way, similar to our read, write, and chain capabilities and delete capabilities in RPG. How we're not having to write SQL, raw SQL statements. Well, the same is true for Object Relational Management, ORM, where they do a higher level abstraction and make it much easier to compose creation, deletion, update statements. And underneath the covers, it implements the SQL for the particular database you're going against. Well, that's the issue. DB2 for I isn't yet implemented in the most popular ORM solutions, though it doesn't look too difficult to do, but it just doesn't exist yet. So you're left with doing raw SQL statements, which isn't the worst thing in the world. It's helped me learn SQL better the past year. So just know that that's something that's coming. Some stuff that's on the web, some different articles. Again, head over to litmus.com and you'll find a whole bunch of articles that we've been writing. But before I go, I just wanted to show you one really exciting thing that I just was introduced to yesterday. So we've all heard of Watson. Watson is the supercomputer capabilities that beat the world's best Jeopardy players about 4 years ago. Well, did you know that they took Watson far from being a fun thing and have made it much more significant in the world we live in? Namely, Watson's being used to help in healthcare and researching analytics and stuff like that. Well, not only can the uber big companies use Watson for their purposes, but hobby programmers can also use it should they want to. So this is actually a small application that I downloaded from the internet, from GitHub, that allows me to run a speech-to-text program right on my IBM. So I can actually record audio of myself. Let's see if this works. This is a live demo. So right now, it's listening to me. My browser window is listening to me, and it's converting everything I say from speech to text, and it's doing this all through my IBMI using Node.js. So this is code that's on my IBMI in the IFS, and then this is my shell prompt right here where I'm running my Node.js application. So I started up the Node.js application on port 50,093, and then here it's running on my machine, and it's still recording me. So this is just one of many APIs that Watson has available to us, and I'm actually on a free account. So I've got so much API calls that I can do a month, and it operates under a free premise, similar to how Amazon does their free stuff. And if I go over a certain threshold, then I get charged, it's 2 cents a minute for processing or something like that. But basically, everything that's happening underneath the covers, if we were to look at this, this is cool, I just got to show it. So I just opened up the JavaScript console, and you can see at the bottom of my window, it's making requests to the server in a fairly frequent fashion. And so every time I'm talking, my laptop's mic is picking up what I'm saying, and it's sending it to the IBMI, which in turn makes an immediate request, a socket request to Watson to decode the audio and convert it to text and then display it back down into my browser window. So just imagine being able to use this maybe for recording customer service calls where you want to have the conversation searchable. Well, now you could record that call, have it immediately converted to text, and save it into a DB2 table. So I just thought that was a cool thing that I wanted to share quick. Well, that concludes this session. I think it's time for questions. Does anybody have any?
So that was a really, really cool thing to show at the end. Thank you very much, Aaron. There are no questions in the chat windows yet, and I won't do the same mistake as another time that I unmuted everybody. So I think it's better that we can keep this for a few more minutes, and I know that you're available online on social media, etc. So hopefully you can get some feedback from the audience later on. I will also upload this to YouTube as well, so you can go back and look into this really good session on Node.js.
Cool. That
Thank
sounds
you
great.
very much, Aaron. So from your point of view, what will be next when it comes to open source and IBMI? Do you have any clues?
Well, I would like to see IBM port the Go language, Go. So that's a language that I believe it came out of Google. And Go has become popular because of something called Docker, D-O-C-K-E-R. And Docker is a way to do virtualization in simple fashion. So you have these little miniature runtime operating system environments that are pre-configured that you can spin up in a couple seconds. And it's great for things like doing continuous integration. So let's say you wanted to test a deployment to production before it actually went to production. You can spin up one of these micro environments in short order and have it operate off of a copy of your production database, test the full release, including database changes and all the different program rollouts before you actually do it, and then find any issues so you don't have any surprises once you do the actual rollout to production. So that Docker is written in the Go programming language. So there's many other technologies out there that IBM could be pursuing to next port to IBMI, and that's on my hopeful list.
Okay, that was a really good point. I hope Tim Rowe is listening to this, or you can use, of course, the common North American, common Europe path through the advisory council to ask for it. Thank you very much again, Aaron, and
my pleasure.
see you in some conference somewhere in the world.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Bye-bye.